Gradients or blends or vignettes or whatever you want to call them, they can be beautiful in your document or they can make your life a study in frustration. I'm going to show you how to make a gradient in the swatches panel first, and then in the next movie, we'll talk about how to apply them to objects in your document and then customize them. To create a gradient swatch, I first open the swatches panel. Then, in the swatches panel menu, I choose New Gradient Swatch. Now, I find it a little bit awkward to make a gradient swatch just inside the dialog box. You can do it, but what I usually like to do is just click OK. InDesign adds the gradient swatch to the bottom of my swatches panel, and then I can apply that to an object on my page. I'll select this frame back here, and I'll make sure the Fill button is on top in the swatches panel, and then I'll click on the gradient swatch. You'll see that InDesign fills that frame with the default white to black swatch. Now I'm going to edit that swatch. Ordinarily, I would right-click on this or control-click with a one-button mouse and choose Swatch Options, but because I've already applied this swatch to an object on the background of my page, I can simply double-click on this. That opens the Gradient Options dialog box. Now, the reason I like doing it this way, making the swatch and then editing it, is because I like having an example on the page in the background as I'm editing it inside this dialog box. I'll actually move this over a little bit so we can see what's going on a little bit better. Also, of course, I need to turn on the preview checkbox, or else this won't work at all. So right now, I've got a gradient, a blend that goes from white to black, and you can see that reflected down here in this thing called the gradient bar. These little squares underneath the bar are called gradient stops, and if I click on one of those stops, you'll see the colors reflected up here in the stop color area. Right now, the first one is CMYK white. It's just 0000, and I can adjust these sliders to anything I want. Or I could type in my own CMYK values on the right. In this case, I'm just going to leave it set to 0. Now, if I click on the other gradient stop, the black one down here, you'll see that the Stop Color pop-up menu changed to swatches. If I want, I can change this from swatches to something else like CMYK or RGB. But in this case, I am going to use swatches. I'm going to choose a swatch that already exists in my swatches panel. I'll scroll down here until I see my orange color, and I'll click on it. Now that updates the selected gradient stop. So now I have a blend that goes from white to orange. I could also add additional gradient stops in here simply by clicking anywhere along this gradient bar. As soon as I click, it adds a new stop. So, for example, I could add green. I'll change this to swatches and choose green. Now my blend is going from white to green to orange, and I can move these gradient stops around anywhere I want. I can also change these little diamonds on the top. When you drag a diamond, you change what the halfway point is between the two colors. It's almost like pulling on the middle of a rubber band back and forth. If I drag this one to the right, I get more green. If I move it to the left, I get more orange. Now, in this case, I actually only want white to orange, so I'm going to get rid of this gradient stop simply by clicking on it and pulling it off the ramp. That deletes it. Then I'm going to go ahead and change my midway point to, let's say, about 50%. And I want to point out that up here at the top of the dialog box, in the Type pop-up menu, I have a choice between linear or radial for my gradient. Linear, of course, is just one direction only, like left to right, and radial makes it look kind of like a circle. It's a little bit hard to see here because the center of the circle is way down here in the lower left corner and it radiates out from there. But in the next movie, I'm going to show you how you can put that center anywhere you want inside the object. In this case, I'm going to leave this set to linear. Then I'm going to give it a name. It's always good to name your gradient something reasonable like white to orange. And then I'll click OK. Now you may have noticed this little button in the lower left corner of the swatches panel. It's actually a pop-up menu, and it lets you control which swatches are visible in the panel. Just the solid colors, or just the gradient swatches, or just the color groups. I'll talk about color groups later on in this chapter. This pop-up menu is helpful because when you have a lot of swatches, sometimes it's hard to find just the one you need. Usually, though, I leave this set to all. By the way, I should point out one more thing here. I'm going to edit this swatch one more time. I'll right-click on it, and I'll choose Swatch Options. Now, you may notice here that there's no way to set the gradient opacity. There's no feature for transparency. That means a gradient swatch cannot go from something like white to transparent. If you need that kind of effect, or here where you can see through the gradient, then take a look at the movie in an earlier chapter about applying transparency effects, such as the blend mode or feathering.